Hi, students. So this is going to be the next lesson on the French Revolution. If you haven't done the first one, I really suggest you go back and look at it because that's really going to go into the old regime and the causes of the French Revolution. And today we're going to be talking about the meeting of the Estates General in 1789, which really gets into the whole process of the French Revolution and gets it started. So you're going to need to know what we did in the previous lesson in order to understand what we're talking about here. So, 1789 is a very important year. That's something that you want to make sure that you have memorized. That is the year that the Estates General meets. It's the year that the Bastille was stormed, and the year that the French still observe today as the beginning of the French Revolution. So, 1789, make sure you know that date. So, in 1789, the Estates General convenes, and the Estates General was an advisory body for the king. They weren't a binding parliamentary body, but anytime you get a whole bunch of people together, especially powerful people, even in an absolute monarchy, which is what France was, it's going to cause some problems, whether they have formal authority or not. So we're going to go into this disaster that is the meeting of the Estates General in 1789. Now, the first problem so yes, it was a disaster. So now the first problem with the Estates General is that it was outdated. It hadn't met in 175 years. Keep in mind that if our Congress were going to be elected today in terms of what it would have looked like 175 years ago, we would have been talking about only a group of old white guys, and a lot of them were, owning slaves and that sort of thing. And a lot changes in 175 years. It would not be acceptable in the United States today to hold elections for Congress in the same way that it had been done 175 years ago. So, just like we've changed in 175 years, France had changed a great deal, okay? Now, here's the way that the Estates General had met in the past, where you have three estates: first, the clergy; second, the nobility; and third, everyone else, the other like 98%. And each estate would cast one vote, and these votes were equal. So keep in mind that, although the clergy and the nobility made up a very small amount of population, they could get together, and if their votes were identical, then that cancels out the votes of everyone else. And you've got to take into account the rise of the bourgeoisie in France. Now, keep in mind that French words can be kind of hard to say. My history teacher, he said that when he first saw this word, he saw bourgeoisie, which, that kind of looks like what it looks like, but bourgeoisie is going to be the French way to say it. So don't go around saying it's bourgeoisie because people are going to look at you funny, okay? Now, who are these bourgeoisie? Well, the bourgeoisie were the French professional class. These were the merchants, the lawyers, the manufacturers, the people who had money and contributed to commerce and industry, but did not have titles of nobility, and they didn't have the protections and exemptions given to the nobles and the church. So these are people who are really doing the heavy lifting in the economy, but they're not getting any special privileges out of it. And these are the people that are bearing most of the tax burden, since the clergy and the nobility are exempt. Remember from our previous lesson? So although the bourgeoisie are the economic producers, you see that an agreement between the clergy and the nobility equals victory, the way that the Estates General is constituted, the same way that it had been since the Middle Ages and had not been updated. And so, because of the way that the Estates General was structured and the way that they voted, 3% in this system equals a majority. And that's not very good math, is it? Right? We know that that's not anywhere near a majority. So Abbe Sieyès, who was a member of the clergy, and you see by abbe, that word abbe there is the word for abbot, the French word for abbot, and it's someone who ran a monastery. So he was a member of the church, and he wrote a pamphlet called "What is the Third Estate?" And this is something that's great to remember for if you're writing an essay or I ask you to write a paragraph or something like that. So make sure that you're taking notes as you go through this lesson. And in this pamphlet, he asked at the beginning, "What is the third estate?" And his answer was everything. What has it been until now in the political order? And he says nothing. And what does the third estate ask or seek to become? And he says something. So essentially, what Abbé Sieyès is saying is that what the third estate is the lifeblood of this country, is the lifeblood of France. That these are the producers, these are the farmers, the manufacturers, or the lawyers, the merchants, and together the third estate drives the economy. The church and the nobility, they just kind of sit there and do their thing. And keep in mind that the bourgeoisie also made up a lot of these civil servants, a lot of the government workers. So, what is the third estate in terms of the economy and production and contributing to the well-being of the country? They're everything. But the problem is that until now, it has been nothing in the political order. The third estate does not have the privileges that the first and second estate have. So, what do we want? The third estate, what do we want? To become something. And this is perfectly reasonable. We're not asking really to become everything in France. We acknowledge that the clergy and the nobility have historical privileges, but just give us something and we'll be okay. So keep in mind that the demands of the third estate right here at first, and what is a more liberal or moderate phase of the revolution, these demands are not necessarily radical. These people are not calling for heads to be cut off or anything like that. They just want some changes in the political order, creating kind of like a constitutional monarchy like Britain had at the time. And so they propose a couple of reforms. And the first reform they propose is doubling the third, meaning that the third estate can have twice as many delegates as the other estates. And that's actually, as you can see in the two dots right here. Now, keep in mind the third estate makes up about 98% of the population. They're not asking for 98% of the delegates. They're just asking for half, right? And, we make up 98% of the country, but all we want is to become something. Now, the second reform goes hand in hand with this. The second proposed reform is to vote by head. And what this means is that instead of each estate tallying its votes and casting a vote as a group, as a single group, we want all of the delegates to vote individually. Now, the goal here is that if you can vote by head, that some of the more progressive nobles and some of the parish priests among the clergy, keep in mind that a lot of the delegates from the clergy were from the third estate originally before they became members of the clergy. It's the bishops mainly who had been nobles before that. So they believe, the third estate believes that if you can vote by head, that some of the nobles and some of the clergy would vote with the third estate, which could achieve a majority on some of the reforms that they wanted. Keep in mind, in order for this to work, both of these reforms have to happen. You can't just have the third estate with twice as many delegates with the same sort of vote that they'd had previously. That destroys the point. So you needed both of these reforms. And Louis is indecisive. Louis the King of France, as we know, Louis the 16th, keep in mind, he's not Louis the 14th. He's not the decisive individual that his predecessor was. So Louis decides, you know what, I'll double the third. I'll let them have twice as many delegates, but we're not going to vote the old way. They're not going to have any more say than what they normally would have. So what Louis is really saying is, I'm consenting to having twice as many ticked off people showing up to the Estates General. So the Estates General convenes in May of 1789, and immediately things get a bit awkward. So here is an image. They met in May 1789, like I said. And when they meet, there's something called the hat fiasco. All right, the hat fiasco. So what happens is everybody comes in the room, the meeting, and And France at the time had something called sumptuary laws. These are laws that governed what people of different social classes could and couldn't do, could and couldn't wear, could and couldn't eat. There even were laws about how many courses of food could be served at somebody's table, based on their social rank. So what happens here is that Louis sits down, he takes his hat off. Uh, the clergy take their hats off because they're a privileged class. Then the nobility take their hats off. Then finally, the third estate, which has no privileges, but they see that the king's taking his hat off, clergy's taking their hats off, the nobles have taken their hats off. And so the third estate decides, after an uncomfortable pause, and some of them start taking their hats off. And before you know it, everybody has their hat off. Now, after another uncomfortable pause, Louis is like, "Oh, I know you didn't just do that." And he puts his hat back on. Okay? So rather than see these commoners, these bourgeoisie, these non noble, non clergy types declaring themselves equal and not wearing hats, Louis decides he's going to put his hat back on, kind of like saying, "I'll show them," right? And so everybody's going to keep their hat on. So once again, Louis has been the king of awkward, so to speak. So this hat fiasco has the States General starting off on a bad note on the very first day. And so what ends up happening is the States General pretty much collapses, and the third estate is so ticked off, they decide, we're not even going to be a part of this mess anymore. And they go off and form what they declare themselves to be, which is the National Assembly. Now, keep in mind, this is without the king's permission. They just say, "We're the National Assembly. We represent the nation of France." And so we're no longer the third estate. We don't have a label. We don't have a number. And you know what? Clergy and nobility, we would like for you to join us as part of this National Assembly. And so that's actually going to be it for today's lesson. We'll continue with this in the next one. And so let me know if you have any questions about this or need any help with anything, and I will definitely do my best to help you. So thank you.